coffee break training. I am super excited to be able to show you some of my favorite Firestop products. These are cast-in-place Firestop devices. Before we jump into this, I want to give a shout out to the first Firestop cast-in-place device. It was developed by a company called ProVent, a family-owned and operated plumbing company who took a look at the industry and decided that there was a better way to do certain things. And they have a bunch of innovative products for the plumbing industry, but also for Firestop. They're the ones that started this whole idea of developing a sleeve that goes into a concrete floor and that serves an additional purpose of providing passive fire protection. When I started in the Firestop industry with Hilti in the late 1990s, they were developing this device right here, the CP680. Since then, most of the major Firestop manufacturers have developed their own version. If you want to know the differences, I strongly encourage you to reach out to the Firestop manufacturers and ask them to give you all of the features and benefits of their particular product so that you can decide which one is best for you. I'll put all the contact information in the training segment below, so you can easily reach out if you'd like to. But regardless of who your favorite Firestop manufacturer is, I want to strongly encourage you to consider using cast-in-place devices whenever you're dealing with concrete decks, especially fluted metal decks. That said, the goal of this video is not to sell you on a Firestop product, but rather, if you find these devices on your project, I want you to know how to conduct a good QA/QC review or a field inspection, because you need to ensure that they're installed properly. We're going to start with an anatomy lesson, and as we work our way through, please know that there are 3 often overlooked items that I'd like you to pay close attention to, and we'll point them out as we go through this parts and pieces, and I'll explain what to look for in a bit. But let's start with this. We'll start at the bottom and we'll work our way up. These are cast-in-place devices, and they're designed to be secured to the concrete formwork or the metal deck. Here's an image of an STI device, and that'll show you how it's placed in the concrete formwork. Let's look at this one from Medicog. On this, you can see the fastening tabs here, and when we look on the outside, you can see that the base is a little bit wider, then it tapers in. Let's look at this one from Medicog. On this one, you can see the fastening tabs here. When we look on the outside, you can see the base is a little bit wider, and then it tapers, and the sleeve here is designed to be cut down, or an extension can be added depending on the depth of the concrete. Different manufacturers are going to have different ways that they're going to change the height. But then again, you can talk with all the salespeople to figure out the benefits of all of that. The one I find most interesting is this one by HoldRite. You just make the height that you need and click it into place. It slides up and down so you can adjust the height and then fasten it to the formwork. Now, some companies will pre-cut them in the field so you don't have to do anything once they get on site. Again, talk to your favorite Firestop manufacturers and figure out exactly what you need for your project. The primary goal of this Firestop coffee break training is to make sure you know the products are an option, but the most important thing we want to cover is to be sure that if you do find them on site, you know how to identify when they're not installed right. With that, we're going to be going through this anatomy lesson. And that brings us to the top here, this lid. This is the first often overlooked item on our list. I'll explain that in a bit, but I want to keep going with the anatomy lesson. Next, I want you to look inside the device. Here's an image from Hilti. You can see the cross-sectional image. They've removed the outer plastic housing so you can see the intumescent ribbon that's on the inside. Above that, you can see the rubber gasket. Guess what? Those are overlooked items number 2 and 3. Let's look at this on another device and see if I can show you on the video. You can see this one has a red metal ring right here. Then inside is the intumescent material and this rubber gasket. Okay, now you've seen the general anatomy of these cast-in-place devices. That means it's time to take a look at our overlooked items list, because these things are the red flags that your QA/QC teams need to keep an eye out for. We're going to take them out of order. Number 3 was a red metal ring. Remember when we were talking about wrap strips and collars? We discussed the fact that factory fabricated collars had a prescribed dose of intumescent material, and it's pretty obvious to see if the collar is not the right size for the pipe. But here's one important difference between the collars and the cast-in-place devices. The collars are only used on plastic pipes. When you're looking at cast-in-place Firestop devices, you have to be careful to ensure that the right can is used on the right type of pipe. Sometimes people assume that they don't have to do anything to check the cast-in-place devices to make sure that they're installed correctly, and that, my friend, is a mistake. If you're running metal pipe, you'll need less intumescent power than if you're running a plastic pipe, That means the devices for the metal pipes will likely be less expensive than the devices for the plastic pipes. So you need to know how to determine the difference between these two products based on whatever's running through them. The first thing you need to know is what brand of cast-in-place device is being used, because identifying devices for plastic pipes versus metal pipes may be different based on which manufacturer you're using. So step 1, identify the brand that you're using. Step 2 is to find out how to identify the metal pipes versus the plastic pipes. Since different products are going to do this in different ways, I want you to reach out to your favorite Firestop manufacturer and find the answer for that particular product. You need to know it. If it's something that can be easily confirmed in your post-installation, great. If it's not, then you're going to have to check these devices before the concrete is poured. The second overlooked item on that list is our rubber gasket. Some manufacturers have tested the devices for a W rating, so it's easy to think that that's all the gasket does. But what if I told you that the gasket is a critical element in the device functioning properly? To explain this, let me share a story with you. I used to say that cast-in-place devices were idiot-proof, but after one project, I realized that when you bring something new to the market, you really need to help the installers understand the product and how it changes their job. I didn't do that very well. And when I walked onto the job site, I saw a guy in the field with a long length of pipe, and he was ramming it up into the opening over and over again. I asked him, dude, what are you doing? And he said, I'm trying to knock out that black thing. That black thing. Thankfully, he had a hard time, but he was determined to make it happen. So he had successfully dislodged the rubber gasket in about 20 different devices. It would be easy for anyone to mistakenly look at that and think, it's unimportant. But please, listen closely, because if you've ever thought that, you are wrong. Now, for full disclosure, I thought it wasn't a big deal too, until I learned what I'm about to teach you. Are you ready? If you have a pipe through a concrete floor and a cast-in-place device with this intumescent wrap strip, and there's a gasket in place, here's what happens in a fire. The heat rises and concentrates around this intumescent ring. The heat causes the intumescent material to expand and fill the void. That sounds pretty basic, right? Now, what happens if the gasket is not in place? If it's ripped or missing, then when the heat rises, it'll go right past the gasket. It will not concentrate around the intumescent product, and that means that the opening will not be closed down as fast as it needs to be. In the longer training segment, we talked about ASTM E119 and UL 263. If you joined us for that, then you know more about how a fire-rated floor is tested. You understand that when they test a concrete floor, it's not allowed to let fire through, but it's also not allowed to let heat through, at least heat sufficient to ignite cotton waste. So we're saying that's 325 degrees Fahrenheit, right? But we don't have the same requirements for our penetrations now, do we? You remember we talked about ASTM E814, UL 1479. That F rating is part of the pass-fail requirements, but the T rating is not. It simply needs to be noted in the test results. Then in the code section, we talked about the T rating requirement. So you know that when a pipe comes through the floor outside of a wall, it has to have a T rating. Now think about that for a minute. Do you have any locations where this is going to be an issue for your project? If so, reach out to me and I'll share some pointers with you. But let's get back to that gasket. If the gasket is not in place when we run the fire test for the penetrations, the fire would likely come through the assembly and it would fail. Now, I can't tell you that that's what's going to happen if there's a fire on your project, because there are too many unknown variables such as fuel load, proximity to the penetration, and a boatload of other complex things that would all have implications if there was a fire. But keep in mind, the more heat we can get to concentrate around that intumescent material, the faster it will expand. So the rubber gasket around the pipe is going to be an important element of the life safety functioning of that cast-in-place device. If it's missing or damaged, or if you want to run a smaller penetration through that opening, please reach out to your Firestop manufacturer and get an engineering judgment that explains how to ensure you have the proper installation. That brings us to our first often overlooked item. Do you remember what that was? That was the lid. The main purpose of the lid is to stop concrete from filling the device and rendering it useless, but sometimes sleeves are run with the intention of allowing future services to be run. So if you're going to leave a cast-in-place device in for later, you have to leave the cap on. If the cap is broken, you can't just leave it that way. Now that you understand the importance of the rubber gasket, you can also imagine the heat leaking out past the gasket and past the open lid. Now, hopefully you understand why. If something happens and the cap is broken, you can get an engineering judgment that will probably tell you to stuff the device with mineral wool. In fact, if you want to be really proactive, here's what I would recommend. If you know that you're going to have a device that's left for future use, simply have your field crew pack those cans with mineral wool before they get placed. That way, if the lid gets broken before they get used, you're covered. But please be sure to share this information with the project owner and the maintenance teams so that they understand why this is all so important. In fact, if you want me to give access to this video so that you could share this information with them, just reach out and we'll figure out a way to make it happen. If you want to help someone get this stuff right, then I am more than happy to help you. So now you know the 3 often overlooked items for the QA/QC folks. The metal pipe devices can only be used for metal pipes and not plastic pipes. The gasket is an important part of the fire performance, and the lid is required for empty devices. Those are the things that you need to know when everything goes right. But we're talking about construction, so we all know things will not always go the way they're planned. So here are a few more things to keep in mind. Sometimes the devices get lost after the concrete is poured, and that means that you should submit an FA0 series detail for blank openings even if you don't plan to use them. It might just happen, and then you don't have to deal with all the paperwork later. Sometimes either the device will be in the wrong place or the design team changes the location of things, so the devices are not going to be used. You already know how to take care of that. But sometimes the newly cored holes overlap the devices and you get a figure 8 shaped opening. This will always be an issue and will require an engineering judgment. If you're working on a fluted metal deck, you'll have a particular issue if you're working with plastic pipes. But that's a topic for when we break down the different construction types. For now, however, here are a few things that I want you to think about if you're using cast-in-place devices. How will I make sure that they're located correctly? What do I do if the submittals require a sleeve to stand proud of the concrete? What happens if a can is not used? What do I do then? What happens if it gets lost in the floor and I can't find it? How do I deal with that? Do I need to consult with a structural engineer? This might be important if you have a whole bank of devices that are close together. And this could be from your scope of work, or it could be from a combined scope with other trades. What happens if I want to run a smaller pipe? For example, if I have a 4-inch can and I want to run a smaller pipe, can I do this? What happens if I find an application where the installers used a metal cast-in-place device and I need to run a plastic pipe in that device? What do I do then? These are all things to think about if you're using devices on a project. The reason I love them is that I believe all projects should have a pre-con plan that involves Firestop. And when you use these things, you probably do. And it reduces the opportunity for human error. It expedites your schedule because there's one less thing to do. You still have to schedule your inspection, but you don't have to schedule your Firestop installation, assuming that all goes well. Just be sure to keep an eye out for those overlooked items, and if you're using them on a project, please let me know what you're using, why you picked that brand, and what you think about them. If you've had a good experience, if you had a bad experience placing them. If you did a good job placing them. If you had a bad experience, talk with the Firestop manufacturer and get some pointers on these things. And if you're working with plastic pipes and fluted metal deck, did you find a particular advantage using these? I think that's where they are most advantageous, especially if you're using a deck with deep flutes like the Epic decking. So that's why I like cast-in-place devices and what you should look closely at on your projects if your team is using them. Please hop into the comment section and let me know what you think. And with that, our coffee break is over and I will see you next time.